Greetings, I'm Keith Klein, the host of the VentureFizz podcast, where I interview the most fascinating people in the tech scene. This is episode 345, and today's guest is Laura Teicher, Executive Director at Forge. Did you know that there are over 7,000 manufacturers in the state of Massachusetts? I certainly didn't, and my gut is that most entrepreneurs think that they need to go overseas for manufacturing versus leveraging local resources. And let's face it, building a startup is hard, but when it is a physical product, it is a whole different ballgame. However, Forge can help. Spun out of Greentown Labs, Forge is a 501c3 nonprofit that helps startups figure out some of the hard stuff through the journey from physical prototype to commercialization. The organization works with startups to help them figure out how to establish and scale manufacturing to sourcing from supply chains and suppliers. Forge has supported over 800 startups with an amazing high survival rate. So you're probably thinking, is this an accelerator or what's the cost? Maybe they are expecting equity from your company. Nope, it's free and their impact is massive, as you'll hear from this interview with Laura. In this episode of our podcast, we cover lots of great topics, like the specialized and collaborative nature of the organizations that support the Boston hard tech startup ecosystem, Laura's professional journey, including how volunteering helped open up doors for her career, all the details about Forge in terms of how companies get involved and how they are helping companies each step along the way, the key benefits to manufacturing locally and some of the hidden costs that can arise from offshore operations, the valleys of death for building physical products, and so much more. Okay, quick side note, are you hiring? If the answer is yes, then you need to add a VentureFizz subscription. We help startups engage with our highly targeted audience of professionals in the tech industry. Plus, we help your company build up its online presence as an employer of choice through our content, which outlines your company, people, and culture. Our content playbook includes videos, podcasts, employee profiles, and so much more. Send an email to info@venturefizz.com for more of the details. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with Laura. Laura, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you because there is so much going on. And I feel like in the Boston tech ecosystem, there's a lot of hard tech. I mean, there's a great number of support from investors. There's some great entrepreneurs that are building companies. And it is so difficult to build a physical product because you have to, create a prototype or design. You go through so many iterations, then finally manufacturing. And there's so much that can get challenged with that process. So it's a lot. So we're going to talk about your organization, Forge, and how you guys support that. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk about the Boston ecosystem as a whole right now and kind of get your point of view, like the lens that you see of what is actually happening in the ecosystem.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I think is really interesting about the regional ecosystem is just how mature it is. As Forge has been growing and interacting with more companies from across the country and around the world, we've really had that reinforced. The Boston ecosystem is very built up. And one of the things that I really enjoy about that is that those of us that are here to support innovation have become more and more both specialized and collaborative. So there are less organizations that are just a general one-stop shop for everything a startup could need. And there are more and more organizations like Forge that will say, at Forge, we're just focused on supporting the physical build, the product development, the manufacturing strategies, the building of supply chains. And that specialization means that, number one, startups can get really deep, meaningful support across a plethora of needs that they're going to have. And number two, we all play pretty nicely together and cross-refer and cross-promote and collaborate in bringing together the true villages you need around these companies to get these products all the way through scale into market as speedily as possible. Because again, when you're talking about hard tech, I think one of the things that's so exciting about it is you're solving some of the world's toughest problems, whether it be mitigating the effects of climate change or preventing climate change, using robotics so that people can be deployed more effectively in the workforce, tackling some of the biggest challenges in public health. These are actual physical challenges in the world, and that means it often takes a physical product or component to deal with it. So it's an exciting space to be in, and it's exciting in the Boston area that there's so much robust support and that we all work together.
Now, I know you're not going to be able to name just a comprehensive list of those supporting ecosystem partners, but who are some of the main ones out there that you collaborate a lot with?
Yeah, absolutely. So Forge is actually a spin out of Greentown Labs, which is the largest climate tech incubator in North America. The idea of what is now Forge was born within Greentown, because again, when you're talking about these climate tech solutions, they usually need a physical build. And there are so many layers of potential added challenges and failure points when it comes to physically building something out. So we were created, we were spun out, and now we're sector agnostic, but I think we see a lot of referrals and collaboration with the more deep tech focused organizations like Greentown Labs, like the Engine, like Mass Robotics. But truly, we do engage across the state, across the region. And we have dozens of what we call ecosystem collaborators that are formalized, where we're cross-referring, cross-promoting, and making sure these companies get all of the support that they need.
Very, very cool. Well, let's rewind the clock. So where did you grow up? What were you like as a child?
I grew up around greater Boston in the suburbs, so primarily Watertown, Belmont, Newburyport. I'm a local gal. And, trying to describe myself as a child, I think I would say introverted, strong-willed, because I think sometimes people think introverts aren't forceful, but they can be. And a bit bookish, artistic, sensitive as a child.
And then you went off to study studio art and English at the University of Rochester. So that was a good combination. I'm like, okay, I need to break that one down.
Well, let me start by saying I didn't go to the University of Rochester to study art and English. I went to the University of Rochester to study poli-sci and cog-sci. They had really strong programs in both. But I was also bookish and an art lover, and I just couldn't resist the urge to paint and draw and read. And so I ended up changing my studies over, and I enjoyed it. But that'll probably set us up for some discussion about why I ended up going back for another degree later.
Well, yeah. So now, like, kind of connecting the dots for me of how you kind of entered the University of Rochester, because like, how did you get your career started?
Well, I graduated and I was still really interested in politics, but I was young, I was finding my way, and it took me, I think, a handful of months to find my first full-time job. I like to be open and honest about those challenges because I know a lot of young folks are going through it right now. But ultimately, I did get my foot in the door working for a state senator. So my first full-time job after undergrad was doing constituent services for a state senator that was representing Western Massachusetts. Which is really nice because now Forge also has an office out in Western Massachusetts that serves there, and we have some long-standing community ties on my side there. But constituent services are essentially customer service for politicians. So every person that called, wrote a letter, sent an email about whether it be a bill or a need, I was responsible for processing it, logging it, reporting on trends. And ultimately, over time, I got to get a little more involved in the policy creation side too, to tackle some of the challenges that were raised from our constituents. But I think, that initial underpinning in what is essentially customer service has been really helpful throughout my career too. Where today I am again in a role where everything we do at Forge is in service of supporting innovators. And I think that customer first mentality is really helpful.
All right. Well, you highlighted that you went back for another degree. So what brought you to Boston University to pursue your MBA?
So I always, I think, had a really strong drive to have an impactful career. And I was lucky to work for two different state senators who, I really believed in the policies they were trying to push, and they really supported me in my career and in my growth. But I pretty quickly hit my head against a ceiling when my second boss was retiring. I was applying for jobs. I would get the answer a few times in a row that I was second choice for a job I was really excited about. And a lot of it boiled down to, we don't know that you can handle budgets, questions about the business acumen. Studying art and English does signal certain things to people. And ultimately, I realized that to move forward in my career, not laterally, I really did need more training and also a degree that signaled that I was capable of doing more than drawing and painting and reading. And so I ended up going for my business degree. It was a fantastic decision for me. I learned a lot, changed my mind in a few different directions about what I wanted to do, but ultimately it set me up to um, grow my career further and eventually land where I am today, which I describe as a dream job for me.
Well, so what did you do right after your MBA?
Oh, I struggled again. So I graduated, and once again, it took me a handful of months to get my foot in the door somewhere for a myriad of reasons, not the least being that I did my full MBA in 1 year instead of two. It was an accelerated program. I didn't want that opportunity cost. I thought I was making a smart decision, but I learned so much in business school and I didn't have time to build all the relevant networks. And I struggled a little bit when I got out, worked in bookkeeping, dog walking, baristaing, temping, you name it. But my first full-time job after business school, I got my foot in the door at a wealth management firm. Because again, my goal was really to show like I can hack it, beyond the things I've done in the past. And I started as a receptionist. I was a small firm in terms of people, but mid-size in terms of assets under management. It was growing fast. And very quickly, I was able to move into a business operations role and lead the charge on all of the compliance, all of the technology, the work of some very small mergers. We acquired some companies, the cultural work of getting everyone integrated. So I got to do some really exciting, meaty work in a scrappy organization that was scaling fast. And I think that combined with my experience in policy and my volunteerism and impact, all of this ultimately set me up for these executive director roles. But I always like to say it is a bit of a meandering path. It was not straightforward for me.
Which I love how you're being so transparent about the journey because when you graduate, you don't know what the economy is going to look like. And to your point, yeah, there's college kids that just graduated that they're having a hard time finding something. And but I think a key part of your story is you, in addition to the role you were just talking about, you ended up spending time volunteering, which really helped paint the picture for me of how you ended up where you are today.
Yes, and the first deep volunteering I did as a full-fledged adult outside of schools was I joined the Young Nonprofit Professional Network Board. And that's an organization that's for people who want to use who want to have robust careers in the nonprofit world. That was before I went to business school. After I went to business school, I shifted my attention to Net Impact, which is a global organization for folks who want to use their careers for positive impact, but not necessarily specifically the nonprofit world. In fact, transparently, I graduated from business school saying I did not want to work in the nonprofit world. I wanted to work in impact. Net Impact was tremendous for me. It's a great network of really focused, ambitious, smart, committed people who want to have a positive impact. So there's the network effect. But both those organizations also give opportunities for volunteer leadership. So, I'm the president of Forge now, as well as the executive director, but my first president role was a volunteer role with Net Impact. And I think those sorts of opportunities can be so transformative for ambitious young people who need a chance to prove themselves and to learn through doing. So it really had a powerful impact on not only my career, but also, some lifelong friendships, which is really lovely.
Well, it just seemed that that translated into, and we're going to learn right now, how you landed as executive director of TIE, which is an organization that I was very involved in probably 20 years ago. So, I mean, they had their TIECon and I was part of the planning committee 1 year and I would go to all the events and a lot of them were in Burlington at the time. So, I mean, it was a long time ago, but I was very active.
That's so cool. I didn't know that. I remember seeing your name when I was at Thai, but I don't think we ever actually spoke when I was at Thai. You may have worked with
It was
my
pre
colleague.
your time.
Yeah,
It
true.
was no,
It's
it was
fine.
like 20 years ago type of thing. Like I'm talking about, I was an executive recruiter and it was a great opportunity to plan an event because I'm recruiting people to speak on a panel that are founders and investors. So I was building my network that I was doing at the same time. So it was great. We did interface with Ty though. I checked my email. I'm like, I bet you we communicated at some point. We did it. We exchanged a few emails while you were executive director there. Nothing
You're so
substantial.
thorough in your preparation. I'm so impressed. And also, I didn't realize you were actually a volunteer in putting together TaiCon. That's really neat. That's I think it still remains the largest startup focused conference in the region. That could have changed. I could be a little bit outdated my numbers, but incredible network. Such a impressive group of accomplished entrepreneurs who've really made it, really want to give back. Um, it was one of those jobs that really caught my interest that I didn't actually think I was going to get when I applied for it. But yes, the fact that I had, experience in wealth management and dealing with, a lot of kind of VIP relationships and dealing with scaling operations and volunteering for impact, all of this came together. I lucked out, I got the job. And I really learned so much on the job about what it takes to have a healthy startup support ecosystem, what it takes to survive as a startup, and also, how to be an effective executive director. So it was really an incredible launch pad for me.
All right, let's bring everyone up to speed on what you're up to now at Forge. How did that come together and the details on what Forge is up to?
So Forge is a nonprofit that helps startups and innovative companies, any company with a new physical innovative product or component, specifically with the physical build. So the methodologies around developing and designing that physical product, the strategies and the expertise that are needed to plan to scale the manufacturing of the product, and then support even building the right supply chains to bring that product through to fruition, scale, deployment. And I think a key part of what brought me from Thai to Forge was my enthusiasm for climate tech and for innovation that is really impacting an issue that's top of mind for me personally, that I'm really passionate about. At Thai, it's completely sector agnostic, but a lot of the companies we were working with were software and they were doing really cool things. But I always sort of gravitated towards climate tech and some of the products I get to help bring into fruition today that, again, are just really solving the toughest problems. And I was actually, it was a mixture, I think, of dumb luck, being in the right place at the right time, and being really committed to being as impactful as possible. So I actually was trying to apply to Greentown Labs, we mentioned earlier, as our sister organization, and I did not get the job I initially applied for at Greentown Labs, but I had a follow-up conversation with the leader of the organization to say, no hard feelings, you need the right people for the right roles. I'm still a super enthusiast of the work you're doing. If there's ever a right opportunity for me, I'd be super excited. And very quickly there was, well, actually, we have a sister nonprofit. We're looking for a leader based on your background. Maybe you should throw your hat in there. The rest is history. And I think it worked out really well for all of us that I landed here. And I still get to help with all of those climate tech companies, but our reach is so much further. We can help a company from anywhere with the making of the product. And it's a really exciting space to be in.
So it's a nonprofit, and you guys, when I was going through your website, you do a lot. So it made me pause. I'm like, how is this funded? Because it's not like this is an accelerator where you're taking a piece of equity or, there's any type of monetary piece from these startups, but I wasn't sure of the business side of how Forge is funded.
Well, I think there's a fundamental assumption that underpins the way we've approached our business model. And this is that we know failure rates for startups are high. We know they're significantly higher for hardware startups, and yet they are solving some of the toughest problems. And I think what we've demonstrated in serving over 800 companies, in sustaining that over 84% survival rate, in helping about 20% of them are now at full scale production. These are incredible rates. There's this underpinning theory that we need to democratize access to the information and the relationships needed to manufacture innovative products. It's just not accessible to your average startup if they're not coming from industry, if they haven't already been through scaling manufacturing. And so this is why we've been really committed to the early growth demonstrating that this is important, it does work, it is value add, these companies do benefit from this help, but doing it in a way that's incredibly accessible and democratizes access to that support. So to date, we have not charged a startup for anything ever, which is highly unusual.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. All of our funding has come from mission-aligned support, so governments, grants. That being said, as we ourselves are getting more sophisticated, as we're growing, as we have more really deep in-house expertise, we have a supply chain network of over 600 suppliers and manufacturers in the region that actually want to work with startups. And as we look to further scale and sustain this organization, we will be adding some tiered additive paid services, but we'll be doing it in a really thoughtful way that doesn't erode any of that accessibility. We're really proud that of all those companies, about 30% are female or non-binary led, about 40% are minority led. A lot of these companies wouldn't get into an organization that had a different business model and is looking to pick what they think are going to be winners in a venture capital sense. There's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the companies that are already kind of on a successful path and in a sector that is easy to succeed in get more support from the get-go. So we thought, listen, if we can just give these companies a little bit of help, avoiding some of the most common pitfalls, getting into production faster with the right partners, it could make a difference. We've proven it. And now we are, to your point, doing more and adding more layers of programming and service. And some of those will have to be paid to be sustainable, but it'll be done in a thoughtful way so that we're not eroding the core goal of just creating access to the know-how and the relationships to manufacture these impactful products.
All right, so you might have companies that come to Forge at different stages, but what's the typical stage of a company that they would get the most value, not too early or too late? And how do they get involved? Like, is there an application process?
Yeah. So I would say our average company, and we all know averages aren't always helpful, but our average company does come to us somewhere in the prototyping process. So somewhere between an alpha and a gamma, at least a works like or a looks like prototype. Doesn't have to be fancy at all, but they really have to have gone through that initial thinking of what might this physical build look like for us to be the most effective and the most helpful. That being said, we really believe that early exposure to some key concepts in manufacturability can make a huge difference on that journey, on doing it efficiently and effectively. So we have a lot of broader educational programming that's accessible to anyone. And you can just have an idea and you can benefit from coming to a workshop about design for excellence, or to an event that exposes you to the ideas of the regulatory requirements for a manufactured clean tech product. Some of this early exposure can be really valuable. The typical company has at least a prototype and is coming to us for more than just education. They also want help with their manufacturing strategy and supply chain. And for that aspect of our support, we really do require at least a prototype and some actual budget to manufacture, because we can't connect you to manufacturers saying you're ready to manufacture if you're not yet in a place to truly engage them, at least not if there isn't transparency there. So the educational programming, a lot of it is accessible to anyone. The connection side of what we do, where we sit down with the company, really understand where they are in terms of manufacturing readiness and supply chain needs, and then start referring them into the experts and the more tailored programming, that we do typically look for a little more traction before we get into that. And then, the one thing I try to make sure I underscore in these interviews as well, because people hear at least a prototype, and sometimes they get stuck on, we work just at the prototyping phase. That couldn't be less true. As you know, not only do you have to do a lot of work, iteration, design, planning to get from prototype to prototype, but then at each level of scale, your manufacturing methodologies may need to change for financial reasons, for production reasons. And so once a company has worked with us, they typically keep coming back. When they go from a prototype to manufacturing, say, 100 of a product, they might need help again. When they then scale that up to manufacturing thousands of a product, they may need very different supply chain relationships and strategies. And so there is no ceiling for engagement with Forge. We still work with those companies when they're at full commercial scale if we can be helpful. But there is a floor for certain aspects of our programming. It's a very long-winded answer. The short answer is if you're thinking of building a product, come to some events and learn some things. If you're building a product, sit down with our program team and we'll help with that process. And even if you're at full scale, if it turns out now you want to do this through a different kind of molding, or you need to shift what type of metal you're making this out of, we can be helpful in thinking through all of those changes too at any scale.
And it's not like this, again, I said this before, you're an accelerator where there's an application deadline and there's a cohort. Like this is just ongoing. So what's the best way to get involved?
So, if you are a startup or a company with an innovative product and you're interested in learning more and figuring out how to engage, I think some very easy ways to do it are to look at our website at upcoming events or our social media, or sign up for a newsletter, come to some events, see what works for you, what you're interested in engaging with more. But if you're really at the place where you have a prototype and you're ready to start talking manufacturing methodologies and get referrals, the best thing to do is to sign up for what we call a product development session. There's not currently any charge for it. You can sign up right on our website. It's www.forgeimpact.org. And there's a tab for startups. So I think it's pretty easy to navigate to. You can sign up right on that website, or you can fill out a contact form on the website, and you can certainly email us directly. But the nice thing about that is it will route you to the right team member for your needs based on things like region, sector, life stage. So sometimes the easiest way to sign up for that one-to-one session would be directly through the website, but it's very accessible. We hold them weekly, and that can be a good jumping off point for us to funnel you into more tailored programming. Once we meet with a company, we might say you would really benefit from this workshop and this workbook, because those are going to address the gaps we're seeing in your manufacturing readiness. Or, great, you're ready to go. You're asking us for someone who understands FDA regulations and can make this piece of your medical device for you. Here are 3 examples based on your specs, and we'll make a direct introduction, which is really high value. Cold outreach from startups to manufacturers and suppliers can often result in no response at all. If it's going through Forge, it's seen as right fit and ready, and you get a quick response and sometimes even free advice, free components, things like that. So definitely worth getting that support.
One of the things that I learned while I was preparing for this interview was there's over 7,000 manufacturers in the state of Massachusetts. And
Yes, are.
I'm not building a physical product, so I guess I wouldn't know that number, but I'm just assuming most people aren't aware that it's at that scale. And I would think most first-time entrepreneurs assume they need to go overseas for manufacturing. So that is not the case.
You could not be more correct. Anecdotally, at least until the global supply chain disruptions we experienced during COVID. Anecdotally, before that, I don't think I talked to a single startup that was thinking they could or wanted to localize manufacturing. It was almost always assuming I have to go overseas. And sometimes that's the case. And there can be very real business reasons to do certain things overseas. But there are actually a lot of competitive advantages, especially at the early iteration stage or for highly regulated domestic markets, to having some of your manufacturing and supply chains locally. And then, of course, there's this added risk management layer we've seen play out pretty aggressively over the past few years. Finally, there's honestly some bad math that can go into these decisions, because startups are used to moving really fast. There can just be an assumption, if I do this overseas, it will be cheaper. And that can be the case, especially for certain commodities, raw materials. But often there's a failure to account for things like tariffs, shipping fees, overseas management costs, supply chain delays. And what we've found is the more that companies do work with us and do unlock the power of localization, the number one thing they talk about is, gosh, it's just so great to drive down the road, see it come off the production line, have clear communication. But there are all these other layers too of regulatory alignment, risk management, hidden cost management. And so companies tend to continue on that localization path where possible once they've seen it in action.
Well, in another podcast, you talked about product design, and you mentioned this term, the valley of death, that lots of startups are trying to avoid. So what does that mean for a company that's a startup building a physical product?
Really, it's valleys of death. There are a couple of really clear, common stages of growth where you see high failure rates. And I think this is known in the startup ecosystem, but exacerbated when it comes to hard tech for a number of reasons. One, building a physical product is more capital intensive up front. It just costs more money to build a robot than to build a coded piece of software. Number two, a lot of the core methodologies that are the underpinning of incubators and accelerators across the nation and the world come from a version of sort of a lean business canvas model that's very tailored to software and emphasizes failing fast early, which you still want to do in hardware. You have to do it a little more thoughtfully. You can't afford to go through hundreds of iterations of the thing. And so what we've found is that a lot of this boils down to spending your money on the right processes and with the right partners throughout the product development and manufacturing scaling process, because that extends runway. You're not making costly mistakes. But the other challenge that exacerbates the valleys of death is just there's not as much funding out there for hardware companies. They're not seen as scalable. There are less applicable opportunities for dilutive funding, especially. And so what you'll see often is you need a slightly more advanced prototype, say a gamma prototype, in order to fundraise or get a pilot or get a customer, but you don't have money to do that, especially if you aren't really careful about that iterating and failing fast and spending on the right design. So there are a couple of valleys of death for hard tech companies. But again, I think as you see the really strong survival and scaling rates at Forge, I think that really underscores that some of this can be avoided by asking for expert help. And I think one of the toughest challenges we face, truly, we work with a lot of deeply technical founders. We're talking multiple PhDs across multiple types of engineering. But if they haven't actually scaled a manufactured product before, they don't have that piece of technical expertise, but they may be more focused on supporting themselves with all the non-technical experts. So we often meet with a company that is asking for supply chain referrals, but as we're going through cataloging their manufacturing readiness, we recognize they're actually not ready for what they think they're ready for. And a couple of quick interventions can help them avoid some really painful, costly mistakes. And we try to focus on those quick, clear interventions before we help them get into further production. And that makes a really big difference. That's just a tremendous amount of mistaken money can get spent in this world. And that really exacerbates those valleys of death.
And what year was Forge started? Like you joined in 2018, but when did the organization start?
So our core programming started in 2015.
Okay.
And at that time, we were called the Greentown Manufacturing Initiative or Greentown Learn. And when I came in, we fully separated from Greentown, we rebranded, we became sector agnostic, and then we started growing our regional reach as well pretty quickly because this really is support that's needed. And now companies are coming to us from across the country and around the world organically because this is really impactful support for an innovator that's trying to manufacture a thing for the first time.
Yeah, well, you talked about the impact earlier, like, you've supported over 800 startups. That's amazing. And a survival rate of over 85, I'm sorry, it's 84.5% or something of that magnitude. That's amazing too. So the work you guys are doing is obviously incredibly impactful. So what's the plan ahead? Like, expansion into other locations, or what's the future looking like?
We are currently working on our next strategic plan, and we need to finish that work before we tackle any further expansions. But I think that is a path we will continue on for a number of reasons. We do believe in the power of localization, not just for the competitive advantages I listed earlier, but also from a climate footprint perspective. You know, about half the companies, almost half the companies we're serving are in climate tech. And if you can localize your supply chains, you are reducing scope 3 emissions, you are contributing to a positive local economy. There are a lot of reasons to do it. But currently, we can only help with local supply chains if you're really in New England. That doesn't stop a lot of companies from using us for educational support and often for supply chain support. But if we can continue to grow across the country where conditions exist for success and sustainability, we can help with more localized production, and we can bring in unique capabilities because there are different manufacturing clusters in different regions. And the more we can connect all of that up, the stronger and smarter and more powerful the whole network becomes, and the larger our impact can be. So that I think that is in the future. But first, we're going to go through the rigor of this strategic planning phase, and then yes, there's a fair amount of inbound interest in a Forge presence elsewhere, and I think it would raise all boats. So we're interested in the future.
That's awesome. All right, so you've seen a lot of companies, and I'm sure you've seen it all. So what are some of the more common mistakes that startups tend to, you know, make over and over again?
Well, one I think won't surprise you at all, but it's just adequate customer discovery before you get too far down the product development path. But this is, again, especially important in hard tech because you can't iterate as many times as cost efficiently. So, really making sure you've gone through that rigor of understanding your customer and their needs and their price points before you build something beautiful that works, but that no one can pay for and isn't going to scale is really important. A really common failure point that we've seen over and over again is over design. So again, something that functions the way it's supposed to function and is beautiful and is quite astounding. I mean, we have companies that are pulling energy out of the humidity in the air and, helping to solve for food insecurity and like the next biggest challenges in health tech, really impressive stuff. And they have a product that works. But often there's sort of a leap to, okay, we're ready to make 500 of these. And if you look at it, there are too many bespoke parts. There are too many expensive components. If you make 500 of this, you will go out of business. So helping companies unlock the methodologies of design for manufacturing and simplification and design for use, design for assembly, all of those design fors, we've just seen horror stories across if you don't pause and consider. Again, if you're talking about climate tech or health tech, these are really highly regulated markets. So thinking about that early in the product process can again save you a lot of reworking or producing something that won't quite match the marketplace. And that's again where localized production can be a competitive advantage. I think another common failure point we've seen is just not taking the time to plan out how you're going to manage cost of goods as you scale production. It's frankly not possible to raise significant capital if you haven't thought that through. But I think, entrepreneurs are by nature entrepreneurial. So often they're sort of, this product works, let's make 100 of them, get them into the market. But you do have to have a plan for how you'll be able to afford to scale it and sell it and have an appropriate margin for it. So thinking through all of these things earlier rather than later can just save a lot of reworking, a lot of time, and really help mitigate the likelihood of toppling into one of those valleys of death that we talk about.
Now, how does your supply chain network operate? I mean, that obviously you highlighted before with the pandemic, it was a crisis. Like, have things evened out as relates to finding supplies and materials to be able to manufacture? Like, is the supply chain operating the way it should these days? And how does your organization help?
You know, I have not personally heard as many horror stories lately as I was a couple of years ago, for what it's worth. And as Forge keeps growing and getting more mature, our own network gets bigger and bigger, which makes it easier for us to help fulfill the needs of the companies. So I don't perceive it as, at as much of a kind of crisis point as it was a few years ago. In fact, when the supply chain disruption started, we were very active in trying to communicate to our companies that even if they hadn't experienced it yet, they might, and it wouldn't be a bad thing to plan ahead and maybe have a plan B. And I think one of the things that has stabilized for the companies that have been through that is they've learned that. And you see less companies that just have one supplier for a critical component, for example. But at the same time, Forge now has over 600 manufacturers and suppliers in our network. We've cataloged their capabilities, their volumes, their peccadillos. We really put in time to get to know not just the innovative companies, but the suppliers, because there's a lot of nuance that can go into certain types of production. Like you might do sheet metal, but do you do it at this scale? You might do molding, but do you do it with this really unique polymer? And those are hard aspects of information to get from like a website or a national database. That really the only way that Forge has that insight is because we've hand onboarded every company, we've met with them, we'll tour the factories. And because that network has gotten bigger, our team has gotten bigger, I think we're in a little bit of a bubble where we're able to help with these needs and sorting through them pretty quickly when something does pop up. So it feels like less of a crisis just within the Forge world too, because of our own growth.
Now you're also a board member for Climate Exchange. So what are the details on that?
So Climate Exchange is a nonprofit that is focused in economic and climate policy research. When I initially joined, it was a little more active in advocating for certain climate policy solutions. And that organization has gone through its own strategic planning. What it does, it's really powerful now, is it actually aggregates and catalogs solutions and information about what's happening in climate and economic policy across the country. And it makes that accessible across the country to the policymakers, to the community advocates. There's a new version of a great dashboard that we'll be putting out soon, where you really can filter by region, by policy type. And as someone who once helped write policy, this is invaluable. Part of the work is looking for comparables and learning lessons from folks who've tried to solve the thing before. They're aggregating it all. They're having calls with policymakers on the regular to give them access. They're publishing it all on the website. And I think, like Forge, that kind of removes some of the friction points and the failure points to getting the important work done. So, I love being part of that board because the team's great, the work is impactful, but also it helps keep me up to date on some of the evolutions that are happening in these policy worlds, which is just an area of interest for me and is intersectional with some of our work at Forge too.
I mean, it's something that I spotlighted at the beginning of our conversation and just bringing it full circle again. It's great that you're involved in all these other initiatives. Obviously, I can tell you're passionate about what you're working on, but also it's just building and expanding your network, your credibility, and whatever the future holds, those experiences are going to be a difference maker. So, all right, three apps you can't live without, and it can't be Slack, Gmail, or Calendar.
This one's actually really hard for me. I might have to turn it back around on you. I was thinking about this. Um, I am a big believer in unplugging when possible in my time off and getting outside. I really am passionate about, the environment and the outside world. So I don't use a tremendous amount of non-work apps on the regular. My answer is going to be very boring. I'm super dependent on Waze, much to my shame. I don't know how to drive anywhere without Waze anymore. When the internet goes down, I'm in trouble. I do like the added ability to see where traffic is flowing and then maneuver. I drive around quite a bit for this job. this one's so dorky. I use the weather app a lot. It's not the best app, but again, as someone who likes to be outside a lot, I plan some of my days and weeks around weather prediction.
Yeah.
And then the last one's probably Shazam. When I was younger, I think like a lot of folks, I was very much into curating my music lists and my playlists, and
Hmm.
I don't really have so much time to put into that anymore. But if I hear a good tune, I'm Shazamming it right away so I can listen.
Yeah, like I just, Spotify, I spend so much time with Spotify just because it keeps getting better, better, better with all my podcasts are there now, all, the audiobooks. I mean, it started out with the music, and when you mentioned Shazam, like the way that it's been personalizing and music discovery's gotten so good with Spotify. So those are three very functional apps. So I applaud that. And I applaud your way of thinking of unplugging because I have similar philosophies. There are certain apps like LinkedIn I use quite a bit too, but it's more of a utility than it is an obsession. So, outside of work, what do you like to do? You kind of gave us some hints already.
Yeah, I think I gave a lot of hits already. So I am naturally an introvert, and I think more folks who are in leadership roles should be saying this loud and proud because I think it's misunderstood. And it doesn't mean that I don't love interacting with people. I'd be terrible at my job if I didn't. But it does mean that I work in a very fast-paced environment. It's very people-oriented. And then when I have my time off, I like to decompress and I like to pursue peaceful activities. I like to just get together with close friends and family. I like to be outside. I like to read, to take in art. It's all very kind of quiet activities, in part because I get to do so many events and so much socialization and be so busy when I'm in my work environment. So it would be interesting if I was a librarian, for example, if my pursuits in my free time would look different. I don't know.
Well, Laura, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through your background story in terms of all the different stops throughout your professional career and obviously all the incredibly meaningful and important work that Forge is up to. It's really extraordinary.
Thank you for having me and thank you for highlighting the work. The more we can get the word out there, the more we can hopefully help companies connect them with the right folks and increase our impact. So thank you for this platform.